See You Now is a podcast highlighting the innovative and human-centered solutions that nurses are coming up with to solve for today's most challenging healthcare problems. Created in collaboration with Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Association, and hosted by nurse economist and health tech specialist, Shauna Butler.
Hi, podcast listeners. I'm Shauna Butler, the host of See You Now. Just a note to let you know that in this conversation, I talk with nurse Danielle Bastien, who is doing some groundbreaking work around human trafficking. This is a very difficult and graphic conversation that may be triggering and not appropriate for all audiences. If that's the case, check out one of our other episodes.
This is something that affects people from all corners of the world. There is no clinical picture or picture of someone in the community that would say, oh, that person's being trafficked. You might have a patient that comes in who is 15 years old and has several hotel key cards or prepaid Visa gift cards, but you know that they've been living in the street. It's knowing your risk factors. It's knowing what the patient is telling you and what signs they might exhibit. There's so many creative ways that we can work around the system that we have, but then with what we learn, change it from the inside.
Increasingly and disturbingly, we're learning a lot about human trafficking in the news. However, much of what we hear comes from just one dimension. Human trafficking is a human rights violation and a massive global health problem. The International Labor Organization estimates that there are over 40 million victims of human trafficking globally, with hundreds of thousands in the United States. A lesser-known fact is that almost 90% of victims have direct contact with healthcare settings, that most of those visits are in our emergency departments, and that nurses are often the first point of clinical contact for victims and play a key role in identification. Most news will feature the ugliest sides of the problem, about the perpetrators, who are most often family members or known persons of the victims, such as an intimate partner. But little, if any, reporting is on what needs to be done to detect and rescue victims, and who are in the best positions to do so. In this episode of See You Now, we meet Danielle Bastien, a nurse practitioner at Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan. As part of her doctoral project, she explored human trafficking and how health systems can combat it. Danielle recognized there was an unmet need, and she didn't wait around for someone else to innovate and address it.
My name's Danielle Bastien. I am a nurse practitioner at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit at the main campus hospital. My job is a little bit different. It's two jobs in one. The first part of it is that I'm a nurse practitioner in the hematology oncology department, and I'm also the advanced practice coordinator for graduate students across the system. So I place students in different rotations if they're advanced practice provider students.
So patient safety is a huge issue, and you have a particular lens on patient safety as a result of some of the research you've been doing on human trafficking. I have to say, from the standpoint of all of the work that I did in my academic preparation, I don't recall there being a huge emphasis on human trafficking.
No.
How did you get acquainted with this really difficult, huge, and disturbing problem, public health problem?
So I live in Canada. I'm from Canada, and I commute every day to work. So my undergrad education was done in my hometown in Ontario, and it was around that time, around 2013, that there was a big case in Canada, and it was called Bedford versus the People. And this woman was advocating that she wanted to have prostitution legalized in the country. So this was a pretty big case that I followed for a few years, and I thought it was really interesting. And at the time, I didn't know what human trafficking was. I just, I was interested in this case and I followed it and I wrote all my papers about it. Okay, what are the pros and cons of having legalized prostitution? In 2014, just before there was a big trend of information starting in human trafficking, I started grad school in the States. And for my doctorate, you had to have a research topic. I remember I was in a lab one day and we were doing pelvic exams, and part of that class was documenting for court cases for abuse. I had always had an interest in domestic violence and sexual abuse, but predominantly against women and children. And it kind of just clicked. Honestly, it was like a light bulb that went off in my head. And I thought, well, what if I do something on this human trafficking that I'm kind of starting to hear about and see what's out there and then change the game, so to speak. So that's when I started doing a huge review on, what was out there, what kind of victim services there were, if people even knew about what was going on and what human trafficking really was. And it just snowballed really into a huge project that I never intended to be that big. And it just went on and on and on. And every time I would, do another search on my lit review, which was my initial manuscript, there was nothing. There was no education that was really being given to healthcare providers. At the time, I was an ER nurse. I have worked in 2 level 1 traumas. That's my background, is emergency. And no one, almost in any of the research that I had specific screening tools for these certain victims. So that's it. That's how it came to me, really.
It is an interesting intersection of law enforcement, and it's interesting that what captured your attention was a legal case. When you were following along the debate about whether or not to legalize prostitution, was it a civic lens? Was it a healthcare lens? How were you processing the information and evaluating it?
I had no healthcare lens at all at that time. I was still a nursing student. And although you have this education under your belt, you have a few years of nursing school, you don't really have the experience to be able to look at something with that because you've never practiced. So it was from a standpoint of, is this going to help people? And like I had said, I didn't know what human trafficking was at the time. So my initial response to this was, they're trying to legalize prostitution. And that's when I started really diving deep into, I better know my facts. And then when I finally learned what, the term human trafficking was, that was it for me. It was the vocation that you didn't know you had,
But as you've been working on this, you have done a brilliant job in helping us to understand the much bigger, broader landscape of human trafficking. Can you?
Right.
Yeah, let's talk about what human trafficking is. Can you break it down, first of all, from a research perspective, and then let's just talk about it from maybe a health and a law enforcement perspective?
Okay, so from a research perspective, the definition that I use of human trafficking is essentially the same as what law enforcement uses. I just kind of want to scale back and say that, so in the year 2000, the UN had their meeting in Geneva, and they came to with what we now call the Palermo Protocol. So this protocol essentially outlined what trafficking in persons is and what it entails, including, types of trafficking, victimization, where it happens in the world, and why it's a crime. So in the most basic term of human trafficking, it is exploitation of an individual. So I have power over you as an individual for whatever means that I was able to get that power over you. And I use 3 elements: force, fraud, and coercion in exploiting you. And that's what makes it a case of human trafficking. The caveat with that is, if a child is being sexually trafficked, only sexually in this case, those 3 elements do not need to be present for it to be considered a case of human trafficking. So let me give you an example. So force would include things like, rape, beating, captivity, isolation to control a victim, keeping them locked somewhere, or, they don't have free movement. They can't come and go as they please. Fraud is any false promises that are not delivered. So an example of that would be, hey, you're really beautiful. Why don't you come and work for me? I'll pay for your education. I will pay for your lifestyle. I'll give you a job, this glorious promise of a life. And then there's coercion. So coercion is things like you are being coerced into something. An example of that, which now, as of a few years ago, is considered coercion, is the use of drugs. The proliferation of drugs has been huge in the trafficking game. A lot of traffickers use that to control their victims. So those three elements are essentially what make up human trafficking.
And the children part of this is a very specific part because they are minors, they're not able to consent, isn't?
They are not. No, that's a whole different ball game. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what are the other buckets that you're looking at as far as how we think about human trafficking?
There's a huge misconception. One of the big ones is smuggling. People automatically associate, because the terms mislead it a little bit, human trafficking, they associate it with this person was kidnapped. Human trafficking is predominantly, the perpetrators are predominantly someone that's close to the victim, especially in sex trafficking or in minor trafficking. So it's a family member, it's a spouse, it's what someone believes to be an intimate partner. This is my boyfriend and this is really their pimp, that kind of thing. So that's one huge misconception that I see. A lot of people automatically assume too that victims are being brought here from other countries and they're forced to work and do all these things. That does happen, yes. Those people came here under the false pretense that they would have a different life. How do you get that type of movement with people? You have to have them cooperate with you. So that's where things come in like mail order brides or job offers, and people come overseas willingly thinking that they're going to live this type of life, and then all of a sudden entrapment comes into play. And now you have issues of false documents. This is for foreign nationals, where if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'll deport you, I'll call the authorities on you. You've left your family behind. They won't accept you if they know what you're doing now. You've brought shame to your family. All these complex issues come into play. When you have a case where it's a domestic citizen, and predominantly what we see here in North America, victims are domestic citizens, it is going to be someone that knows the victim, okay? So that's where you have a friend of the family or a family member that's trafficking a child, for example. So there comes the psychological manipulation, which is a huge part of trafficking, because consent isn't there when someone is being trafficked. They're doing something under the threat of violence or punishment, and psychologically it plays a huge role in keeping someone under the grip of a trafficker.
Who's vulnerable to being trafficked?
The risk factors that make someone vulnerable really affect a large portion of people who are exploited. So if you have frequent runaway attempts, or you've been in foster home to foster home, or you were homeless, for example, specifically if you came from a history of familial abuse and sexual trauma. A high number of victims across research show that people who were exploited for purposes of sex and sometimes labor, they have a history of being molested or being raped previously. Let's give an example of, if I come from a home where my parents are abusive, maybe I'm being sexually abused as a child, and I never heard them say, I love you, or you're beautiful, or any of the things that a parent should say to their kid, and I run away from home, and now I'm living on the streets, and someone approaches me, because this is exactly how it happens. 80% of trafficked people who are runaways, especially minors, will be approached by a trafficker, usually a pimp, within the first 48 hours of being away from home. This person comes to me and says, "You're beautiful. I want to take care of you. You deserve a better life. I'm going to pay for everything that you need, and I'm going to give you somewhere to stay." If you end up in this situation where there's this abuse going on, but there's still that manipulation of, well, you don't deserve any better. But they do tell you, "Oh, I love you, baby. Stay here and do this for me. I just need you to do me these favors and all these things." Or you go back to the home where no one gave you that love to begin with. Number one, you don't feel that you deserve a life better than what you've ever had. Number two, you've been traumatized. Number three, at the outset of this relationship with the trafficker, you still see yourself as being better taken care of than you were in your previous situation. These people are vulnerable, especially minors who don't have a family unit. They have no self-esteem. They have no education. Their prefrontal cortex isn't even fully developed yet. They're psychologically manipulated. So it starts off as this beautiful relationship, and then the grooming process happens. You start to get groomed into the industry. Everything's going really well. "Well, I got your nails done and I got your hair done, but I need you to go to this party and do some things for me and then bring me back the money that you make." This is where it starts, this debt bondage, this "I did you a favor," this grooming of young, vulnerable people. And when you've become wrapped up in this type of world, in your mind, you think that that's all you deserve because you've been beaten down for your entire life, for years.
What is somebody who's being trafficked look like? I mean, it's not just women. It's not just children. Paint me some pictures so I know who to be looking for.
I always say, I can't order a blood test and see if someone's being trafficked. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of thing. This is something that affects people from all corners of the world. It affects every race, it affects every gender, and all ages. So there is no clinical picture or picture of someone in the community that would say, "Oh, that person's being trafficked." Someone could look very put together. They have a lot of money. And if that's the case, you might want to look deeper into that, especially with minors. You might have a patient that comes in who is 15 years old and has several hotel key cards or prepaid Visa gift cards or large cash amounts on them or a really expensive purse, but you know that they've been living in the streets or that they were run away from home. It's knowing your risk factors. It's knowing what the patient is telling you and what signs they might exhibit. I can't just look at someone, like a jaundice and say, "Oh, that person's liver might be failing." I wish it was that easy.
But human trafficking encompasses so much more, particularly when it comes to farm laborers or any type of laborers. From your work and your research, what do we need to understand about human trafficking that includes all of these other facets?
So we predominantly see sex here in North America, but another misconception that people have is that that's either the only type of trafficking or that's the most common. And really, labor trafficking is the most common form globally. So you're going to see groups of people that are trafficked, and in the industries you would most likely see them would be agriculture type of work, construction, hospitality industries, so food service and things like that. Domestic services is huge on that too, as people working in the home providing either elder care, child care, or even just things like landscaping in the home. And what makes situations like that very dangerous is that these people are brought over by essentially their owners, because let's call it what it is. This is a form of slavery. They're being brought over from other countries. They don't know the language. They don't have a social support system. They're isolated. Generally, they're living in the home with the people that are trafficking them. And they are working long, erratic hours. If it's something like a farm where there's a lot of migrant workers, the living conditions might be very poor. But they don't know how to survive outside of that trafficker because of all these threats that they're being given. If you don't work, I'm going to send you back home. I'm going to get you deported. Your documents aren't real, et cetera, et cetera. So they're not only scared of the repercussions of going against the trafficker, but now they have the other element of they're completely out of their own world, isolated here, and they're afraid that they're criminals because that's what the trafficker is telling them. All these things make up the manipulation that keeps these people entrapped, and that's what makes it a case of human trafficking. There was a case a few years ago where I don't remember if it was Ohio or Michigan, but there was a restaurant owner and he had several workers from overseas, had them living in a house, and the locks were on the outside. So every morning before work, he would have to unlock them out of the house to get them to go to work, and he would take them back later and lock them back in. They were cooking on what I think was a hot plate in the basement, and a fire started, and they all died locked in the house. And that's what spun the investigation, because when, fire arrived, they realized that all the locks were on the outside. But the neighbors who are seeing this go on, they don't even see the subtle signs of, why is the lock on the outside of the house? Why are these people only seen when they're leaving and coming back from work with the owner of the restaurant and the owner of the house? These things that we kind of shun away as, well, that's weird, but we don't really trust our gut when we see things. And that's the driving factor of needing to make a change in healthcare, because we are going to be the ones that see these victims predominantly during their time of exploitation, but we're identifying them the least out of anyone else.
How many people globally do we have a sense are experiencing being trafficked?
24.9 million. That's a staggering number.
It's jaw-dropping. And the McCain Institute has been a real driver in putting together national report cards to really help us understand where on a global matter, in conjunction with the UN and other global bodies looking at global health issues. They've really been looking at this to help us understand what direction are we going, who's doing what, what's working, what's not working. So that's the global scale of this. What about North America? What are the numbers there?
I don't know the full number in North America, but I know that 67% of trafficked individuals are from North America. As far as other numbers, this is such an underground industry. No one could ever know how many people are trafficked. I mean, victims don't even know that they're being trafficked when they are. So I don't like to give solid numbers unless I know that, these are estimates across the board based on research. So they do estimate there's around 50,000 people being trafficked into the U.S. a year. Again, but who can say how many there are, right?
Yeah.
We can't say who has the most victims. We don't know. We only go based on reported cases across North America.
Regardless of the numbers, we're all in agreement. It's a big, difficult, disturbing problem.
Exactly.
So in some of the research, there's an indication of high 80-90% of human trafficking victims having contact with healthcare. And a lot of that is in emergency departments.
Yeah.
And yet, while we're the group, healthcare does have the greatest exposure and opportunity, we're not doing a particularly good job of identifying who is experiencing trafficking. This is the problem that you have really dug in and said, I want to be a part of that solution. Can you walk through some of those numbers to help us understand, what it is that you were seeing in your practice that helped you to understand that nurses specifically are uniquely situated to identify and intervene in human trafficking?
In the research, as retrospective studies for victims, they found that 88% of victims during their time of exploitations had direct contact with a healthcare provider. 67% of those are in the emergency department. So say, for example, I'm a trafficker, okay? I'm trafficking you.
I
And
don't like this story. We'll roll with it.
okay, there's a trafficker and they're trafficking someone. I'm not talking to you. And I'm trafficking them for sexual purposes, so commercial sex. Do you think that I'm going to bring them to get regular health care? No. And I have spoken to victims who did have well checks and had well baby checks when they've had children during their exploitation, all these things. But for the most part, I'm not going to bring someone in to get seen unless I'm losing money on that person.
Mm-hmm.
You are my property. I make money off of you. I don't care about you. I'm not going to bring you in for well checks. So what's going to happen is we need a quick fix for whatever's been going on that's making this person lose the trafficker money.
We're going to seek episodic care.
Right, exactly. So they'll present to the emergency department, possibly with ongoing untreated infections, things like STIs, UTIs, PID. We found victims who came in and they were found overdosed, or they were found face down in the street. And you'll also see things like assault. You know, you'll get dropped off, you've been assaulted, go fix your broken nose or your broken bone in your face or whatever it is, and get right back out there and go to work. And this is predominantly what you're going to see, mostly reproductive complaints. So that kind of gives way to the provider to look at the history of that patient if they have been there before. And sometimes you will have multiple visits with the same type of complaints, or you'll just have a story that really isn't matching up to what they're saying. And maybe they're with someone and they're kind of controlling the conversation, and it might look a little bit like domestic violence. And then you kind of put the two and two together. So it really just depends, but you will see them likely in an acute care setting, yes.
Yeah, so a lot of what you're describing there feels random and somewhat haphazard, and we're just hoping that maybe we might pick up on these signs and symptoms. So when you started to notice that, look, we just don't have an organized approach to all of this, what was your thinking about, all right, how can we do this better? We have a bunch of data points. We have a lot of research on this. What does it look like for us to organize this in a way that, just like we've done with so many other screening tools, how are we going to screen and identify and then have the ability to intervene?
So when I was first doing the research, there was a lot of research out there about signs and symptoms, about, survivors and victims. There was not a lot that was ER specific in identifying. Most of what I had found at that time were retrospective studies that, look back, what did you present with? What kind of conversation did you have with the provider? Did they assess you? This type of thing. There was no screening tool assessments. And that's when I started looking into the policies that we had at our system. So looking for anything that we might have on human trafficking. So as far as what we do to identify or what we do once we identify a victim, no one had policies. I called colleagues at other hospitals. I looked everywhere. I looked online. I looked in research publications. I looked in textbooks.
Did you look outside of healthcare for any of those policies, or?
I did. I looked everywhere, Shauna. Like, I spent months trying to see. I called law enforcement. I called state police. I called the FBI. I called Homeland Security. I called everybody. And there was at the time starting to kind of come out was algorithms.
Right.
This is what you do in a healthcare setting, but it was very muddy still. The waters were not clear. No one was on the same page. And there really wasn't a unified approach to trafficking, even between local jurisdictions of law enforcement.
Can you remind me what year this is that you're doing this initial search?
I started this in 2016.
Okay.
And it took me about a year before I implemented the actual project.
So we're in a place where we have robust databases. We're actively using the internet to manage electronic health data. So
right.
It's possible. We've got data and we've got technology. But right now, at that point in time when you were looking at this, there was not a coordinated effort across multiple agencies or sectors that could help us to put the dots together with data.
Yes, exactly. So I said, well, I can't really move forward if I don't write one. So I wrote one, just the policy portions. And it took some time because there was so much to encompass. And with the legal part of it, I had to make sure that it was airtight in the sense of, okay, what are the police doing? What do we do to work with the police? And so that took me about 6 months to write with edits because it was difficult because, like I said, no one knew what the other person was doing and no one had a unified approach. And so once that was done, then I started to research signs and symptoms, the education behind human trafficking. I had to educate myself thoroughly before I could even tackle a project like this.
Where did you go for that education? Because that's not in nursing textbooks or really much in the way of healthcare. If you go look at PubMed or any of those places, it's there, but it's not really neatly organized. And here is Human Trafficking 101, 201. You probably had to do a lot of piecing together.
It was a lot of piecing. And the thing about human trafficking is that it is a small network of people. So I started emailing experts all over the States. That's what I did. I looked up courses online. I looked up any textbooks, ordered them, read them. I've probably got 1,000 textbooks on human trafficking.
Wow.
Survivor books. I read as many articles as I could find that were related to what I was doing. I must have spent 6 to 7 hours a day for a year just reading about human trafficking. And I don't even know if there's a word to describe how you feel when you start to understand, even though I could never understand it, the complexities of it and how dark you start to feel when that's all your life has is just researching this heinous crime. And I'm a very animated person, so I wear my emotions on my sleeve a lot of the time. With doing this for a year straight, and since then that's all I've really done in my spare time too, your blood boils because of how angry you are and how marginalized this population becomes, and no one, it seems like, is doing anything. I think that really is what drove me through to finish, even though it was difficult.
Yeah, I would imagine. And I just want to pause here for a moment, Danielle, and say it's hard work what you're doing. It hurts your soul.
It does. It hurts.
Yeah, when you dive deeply into this information and this set of activities and indecencies and inhumanities, I would imagine you've had days where it was just kind of hard to get up. It was hard to look out there and feel like things were going to be okay.
Some days you have to force yourself to take a break, and then I would be disappointed in myself because I would think, why are you so depressed? You don't even know how the victims feel. You don't get it. I felt like I didn't have a right to take a break. It was this weird internal battle.
Now you've got a policy in place. Policy is just a policy. It's not active until people start doing something with it.
Right.
How did you transition from policy to screening?
You're exactly right. The policy was to back us up. So what I proposed to the system was an EMR change. So we used
your electronic health record?
Exactly. So the policy was really to be an airtight backup to integrating a new design into the software. In the past, what they added was, do you feel safe at home? And I think that for where domestic violence was 20 years ago, that's a great question. However, there's a lot of problems with that one question, right? And as an ER nurse formally, you could probably say, how many times did you see someone ask that question in front of the person that was with them?
Yeah, I was going to say,
Right.
You have to have the right setting in order for that.
You have to have a setting, and you really have to look at the whole picture. It's really hard in healthcare to stop what you're doing sometimes because you're so busy. Every facet of healthcare is just like, go, go, go. Let me do this because I have these 10 other things I need to do, right? Like you just have your plate full constantly.
Yeah. And
So,
let's paint that picture, because from the standpoint of really understanding in an emergency setting, first of all, it's generally really loud. It's busy, it's loud.
it's
There's
loud.
a high level of tension. And that triage process, when you have people coming in, people come into the emergency department because there is a set of urgency and pain and suffering. It's not going to an amusement park. So as you are in this setting and people come to you, your description of how you had it changed into electronic medical record, what does that actually mean from the standpoint of as a patient coming in, as a person coming into the emergency department? Why does it make a difference that it's in the electronic medical record?
Well, the one thing is that generally the person can't see the computer that you're using, and two, it can toggle into next steps in the screening, which is what I'll explain. So
Okay.
you have a patient that comes into triage because it was an initial triage screening process that expands to the primary caregiver in the back. Okay. So this person comes in and there's no questions that need to be asked in triage that are subjective. It's an objective screening. So there's a set of questions, things like, does the person exhibit signs of neglect? Does their story not add up with the history that they're giving, with the injuries that they might have? Have they endorsed a high number of sexual partners? Do they hold their own ID? Questions that we put together that fit the population for our area. When I've talked to other hospitals who wanted to implement the same process that I had, it was really important for me to tell them, don't use the questions I have because you might be in a rural community hospital with a totally different population. You might not want to ask questions that wouldn't really pertain to that. So an example of that would be if you have a high homeless population, this person might not have identification. So you don't want to flag them because maybe you know them regularly and they don't have ID. Or maybe you have a high population of people coming in on substances and they don't know where they are. These screening questions were built in based on the population that we had. If the person comes in and someone in triage, based on the education that I gave them, thought they could be a victim, they would flag this person. Okay? So then it would populate this objective assessment. And if any one of those were positive, we would move forward with a comprehensive exam.
So let's talk about those signs of neglect. What does that look like?
Most commonly would be something like, is the person malnourished? Are they unkept? Are they severely dehydrated? Do they have ongoing symptoms of easy to treat things? And then you might also see people who are victims who are very put together. And the traffickers are also very put together. So it is difficult, and you want to look at signs as well as what's going on with the patient. So is the person at the bedside controlling the conversation? Are they speaking for the patient? Has the story changed? Do the signs not match up to the history that they've given you? Have they been here before with similar complaints? If they're not with someone at the bedside, are they frequently answering calls and texts, almost like they're following an instruction of someone on the phone? An example of that would be a patient during a pelvic exam who's answering the phone and answering exam questions during the pelvic on the phone. That's not a normal action. So it's a large picture that you want to look at. And the main thing that we try to do to move forward with an assessment, if any signs are exhibited, sometimes even just the mannerisms of the patient might tip you off. Are they avoiding eye contact with you or with the person they're with? Do they have an inherent submission to that person? There's also been situations where I've had victims be very labile. You know, they're talking and then all of a sudden they're very aggressive and angry. They don't want to talk to you. They want to leave. It all just depends on the situation. And if that's the case, we try and separate that person from the visitor that is with them to move forward with a full interview, essentially. And we try and get social work on board and, alert who's involved in the care. So security is alerted, the physician or the APP that's seeing them, and the nurse, and you try and work together as a team to get that interview and see if the person is in fact being trafficked.
So that's in the initial triage portion of this. Once I think you mentioned some of the things, once you have suspicions, that activates an alert system?
So if you have suspicions, that's what opens up. So the triage question is, do you suspect this person could potentially be a victim of trafficking? So it's one question, and then if that's yes, it opens up an automatic set of questions, those objective questions I talked about with the signs and symptoms. If any of those are positive, an algorithm for reporting will come up on the screen. It'll ask you who you notified as far as care provider, if a government agency is notified, if the hotline is notified. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline is the one we use. And then if it's a child, there will be a direct link to the form for child abuse. And then it'll go from there and have blank notes. So did you alert CPS, the local authorities? Because it's different depending on the victim. If it's an adult, you offer them support and tell the hotline of the trafficking situation, but it's up to them if they want to accept help. However, if it's a minor, it is reportable and you have to report it to the proper authorities. So that's all in there as well.
And so you've taken this very random, haphazard hope that some of our frontline responders would be able to, in the chaos of all the busyness in the emergency department, be able to detect these really subtle things that could very much be a part of somebody experiencing homelessness, somebody mental health issues, maybe they've been injured outside and they're in construction work, and of course they come in somewhat disheveled, or there are any number of confounding factors where it would be very hard to sort through and say, yeah. And I guess when we go back and we look at it, we realize all of those things were there.
Sometimes we look back. I gave extensive education to all staff in the ER prior to this going live. So whoever was in triage, it was a mandatory education. And now actually Michigan and other states mandate education on trafficking anyway for licensure. So it kind of came in at the perfect time. So I did give them all extensive education with case studies and online modules so that it could be distinguishable to them based on what they knew before. And maybe you have that disheveled construction worker, but are there other subtle signs that you might not have picked up before? The thing is that if someone gets flagged, it gets assessed, and if none of those are positive and they kind of look into it, because you do end up assessing people who aren't trafficked, it's just a bizarre situation, or maybe you assess the situation and find out this is actually domestic violence. So, it's a nice tool to have.
This is now part of our electronic health record within your health system. And as people come through the emergency department and they're initially triaged, there is a screening question that prompts any of the nurses doing this triage to be mindful of doing that assessment.
Yes, exactly.
What results have you guys seen with that?
In the first year and 2 months, there were 22 victims identified. 4 were minors.
Wow, well, first of all, for each one of those individuals, that's a life-changing event. That's extraordinary.
The sad reality is a lot of these people need several rescue attempts before they can leave their situation. So unfortunately, a lot of people, you just have to kind of offer them help, tell them that they can trust you, build that relationship, and that if they want it, you're there.
Right. As you've been able to identify individuals, how is that helping us to better understand? It troubles me to have to use the word industry, but this really is an industry, and the human trafficking industry exists and continues to grow because it is incredibly lucrative.
In the U.S., it's $30 billion a year industry, and it's only getting higher. It's the third most common transnational organized crime. Well, 8 years ago it was. Now it's the second most common, only behind drug trafficking. And a lot of the principles of economics come into play here. If I sell drugs and I have a truck full of heroin and I sell that heroin, I have no more heroin. If I'm trafficking you as a person, I can just sell you over and over and over again. There's there's no overhead cost.
Right. It's a renewable resource.
Exactly. Until you're losing money on that person, you will keep them working. A lot of known crime groups have changed their tune largely from guns, which is the other big issue of trafficking, guns and drugs, to humans instead. So it's a lot less risky. It's a lot more money. And unfortunately, it's not going anywhere.
Specifically with the human trafficking problem, what do you think it is that nurses can do to address this problem?
First of all, what we need to do is have a screening tool. That's the number one thing. And I'm not saying that because I did one and it was successful. That's how it starts. We can't move to a prevention role until we can identify how often we're seeing this problem. If you work in a health system that does not have a policy in place, write one. Call me. Use mine. Tailor it to fit your needs. I've shared my work with over 50 institutions, portions of it that I can share. And that's all they needed. They call me and say, we've been working on this for 2 years. We never really quite got it. Can we use some of this stuff that you've done? Because we don't know how to move forward. And sometimes all you need is that template, because from the policy, then it snowballs. Then you've got a committee that's doing this. Then you've got an action plan if you have victims. Then you're going to start to look at what are our local resources. Okay, now there's gaps, right? So we have this acute phase shelter. Maybe it only accepts young women from the ages of 15 to 23. And we have this 100-bed unit over here, but it's more religion-based, so they might not have victims that would want to go there specifically. What are the gaps in your community after you've identified the ones in your system, and then fill them? There's so many creative ways that we can kind of work around the system that we have, but then with what we learn, change it from the inside. Where human trafficking is now is essentially where domestic violence was 30 years ago. What we need to do is not even just in nursing or even in healthcare as a whole. We need to move to a gold standard of care. As far as healthcare goes, we all need to be writing policies, have those in place that are system-wide, set in stone. If we have a victim, this is how we will treat them. This is the empiric guideline of what we will test them for, what we will treat them for, because they should be getting essentially certain types of medications if they're coming in, especially if they're sex workers, if there's a history of sexual abuse going on among children. And then moving forward for the rehabilitation phase, community resources are huge. You have to know what's going on in how are you going to help a victim in the ER or in any setting, and then okay, good luck, and you discharge them. Where do they go, right? They need safety. They need law enforcement. Sometimes they might need visas to stay here if they're a foreign national. You might have to know what CPS in your area does. It just educating yourself and then bringing that to your workplace where it's missing is the first step. We need to all work together to have that gold standard of care.
And Danielle, how is technology helping to facilitate us being able to pick up these cases and put the dots together so we can see where these trafficking rings exist?
You know what? One of the biggest things actually is the reporting procedures through the hotline across the U.S. because in the last few years, reports have gone up by 25%. And the reason that is because of victims who are now self-identifying and self-reporting. Things like texting or cell phones being able to call certain numbers. You can text the word help to the number Be Free at any point until 11 p.m. And you can call the hotline phone number, which is 1-888-373-7888, any time of day or night, and someone will assist you on the phone of how to get out of your situation. So the internet largely has educated people, of course. We see things in the media, but victims are, they're finding information on the internet and they're saying, wow, this is me, I'm a victim. And I've spoken to victims who have told me that story. They left their situation where their boyfriend was their pimp. They have a child with that pimp. They are trying to escape from him. They don't know where to go. They're Googling things. Oh, and this human trafficking site keeps coming up. That's not me. That's not me. Until they finally open it and realize, oh my God, that's me. The information that's being spread across social media and the internet is incredible for educating victims that they are victims, and for people like you and me who have a world of knowledge at our fingertips to see, okay, who's got a screening tool that I can use as a template? Who's got an education seminar coming up that I can go to? How it's kind of impeded is that I have seen a lot of victims with GPS tracking in their cell phones. Yeah. So that's difficult as a nurse. I would say if you ever do have a victim, which most listeners probably have and didn't even know it, when you separate your victim from the perpetrator or they're alone, make them leave their cell phone in a different room, because you would be surprised to know how often there are GPS and listening devices installed on those phones.
What's the relationship between human trafficking and large sports events, entertainment events?
So the relationship between large events and tourist areas as well is, okay, so you not only have large groups of people coming in, you have people coming from all over the world. So generally speaking, when you have a large sporting event, you're going to have increased rates of human trafficking because of supply and demand, those basic principles of economics. So things like, we have an international auto show in Detroit. It comes every year. That is the biggest trafficking event in North America annually. There's a 300% increase in trafficking at that time.
And how are the healthcare nurses, frontline responders using these innovations that you've helped to create? How are they working together so that, as we know that this is a moment in time where we're going to see an increase, how do we use all of these tools and healthcare resources, and particularly nurses? I mean, we do large events. We know when large events come in, we're going to have a lot more people coming into the emergency department. What does that formula look like so that we can actually do a better job of helping people who are being trafficked?
So around those events, especially with the auto show and big sporting events, so we have big concerts, summer type stuff, not now because of COVID, but generally, we would put out flyers in staff areas, and we would put reminders out and emails, just letting you know that auto show is this time. It's usually, I think, in the winter time, January, February. There's this many increase in victims. We would put the 300%. Make sure you're looking for these signs. Basically just reiterating what we had already educated them on, but as a reminder, hey, if you haven't been doing these assessments, make sure that you keep doing them, because there's going to be an increase in this area. So we would put out regular reminders for big events like that.
And how has COVID impacted human trafficking and healthcare's ability to screen and detect and intervene?
During COVID, I had reached out to some colleagues that work in trafficking, and some of them are law enforcement. They're not all healthcare. And the discussion got brought up, and there was actually an article posted in Detroit about it. How is this affecting victims during this time? Because naturally you're going to think, okay, people aren't working. There's not a lot of money. People are stuck at home, especially if they're being trafficked by someone who's an intimate partner, which would be largely sexually. Assaults are going to go up, right? There's going to be a lot of physical violence, especially with the domestic violence perpetrators as well, because then there's increased rates of drinking or drugs. And also then you have the mental stress that's going to go on these victims. I'm not making my quotas of money. I'm not getting as many customers. I'm going to get beaten if I don't bring this money home. And additional stress of all those things, plus what if you have kids with your trafficker, or you live with your trafficker? So just increased rates. So it's an unprecedented times as far as COVID goes, because everyone's world got turned upside down. But the faceless people and the nameless people, we forget even more sometimes. These people that are suffering and now might have it even worse. So as a healthcare provider, when things like this happen, keep in mind that they're probably at higher risk of getting physically abused and might be coming to you in the healthcare setting.
Yeah, it sounds like with that scenario that we need to broaden our network. And while we know that there's an enormous amount of presentations to an emergency setting, we probably need to think about the other places where people who are being trafficked are going to appear for that episodic care. It's a real call to action and awareness throughout our nursing colleagues. And I'm sure that school nurses have been a big part of this, and public health nurses, community-based nurses, dental practices. We're probably going to see a lot more there where we need to be doing a lot of outreach to build awareness.
Right. We need to have it everywhere. Honestly, everyone should be getting education at the very minimum, just to know the basics surrounding it and what to look for, because you really could save someone's life.
Yeah. Danielle, this has been enlightening in a difficult way. And I cannot thank you enough for the commitment that you have and the conviction around this. And to some degree, it sounds like there's a significant personal sacrifice for anybody who does this work. I'm incredibly humbled and grateful, and at the same time disturbed. And, feel, again, very motivated to action and making sure that people who are in these really deplorable circumstances, that we can help identify them and give them hope and pathways to get to a healthier place, because there is hope. Yeah. There is a better life.
There is.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the kind words. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Anything else that you wanted to add? I was going to make sure that there isn't a piece of this that I've missed going over that we need to know about.
If this is something that you or anyone else is interested in, look at information and stay up to date. And the new Trafficking in Persons report just came out. Just be aware, this is going on. And I would put money on that, just like in lectures I give, whenever someone gets some information about trafficking, they go, oh my God, that was what that patient was. There's always a patient memory that comes up. And if you want to help these people, definitely look into what signs and symptoms are and use your gut judgment. If something doesn't seem right, it probably isn't.
Danielle Bastien is a nurse practitioner at Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, Michigan, and the innovator behind developing a system-wide policy and screening tool that has been successful in detecting victims of human trafficking and initiating their rescue process and road to recovery. Her work has been adopted and adapted throughout the U.S. and continues to influence and shape how we identify victims. Human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum, but rather is the result of a range of complex problems, social disparities, and human despair. Poverty, substance abuse, and housing insecurity can put people at risk of being trafficked. Families experiencing addiction, coupled with poverty, put children at risk for neglect and abuse, which in turn puts those children at risk of being trafficked. According to data from the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, the coronavirus pandemic and subsequent shelter-in-place orders may already be leading to an escalation of human trafficking. Recognizing that nurses play a key role in detecting and protecting victims of human trafficking, the International Council of Nurses has created resources to actively guide nurses in this role. We've included links to these resources at seeyounowpodcast.com. While awareness about human trafficking among the general population is growing, so too does the problem. Experts in many fields, like Nurse Danielle Bastien, are developing innovative approaches using data and algorithms and building roadmaps to rescue victims. They recognize the key role of healthcare systems, specifically nurses, in detecting and protecting victims of human trafficking. As Danielle said, this type of exploitation in crime takes place in plain sight. If you see something suspicious, say something specific. You just might save a life. For See You Now, I'm Shauna Butler. Thanks for listening.
Johnson & Johnson has always supported nurses as essential healthcare leaders and is proud to power up nurse-led innovation that is transforming health outcomes through skill building, leadership development, and more. The American Nurses Association ignites and celebrates nurse-led innovation to redefine quality nursing and advance healthcare for all. Johnson & Johnson and the American Nurses Foundation are proud to have launched the Coronavirus Response Fund for Nurses. Go to the American Nurses Foundation website to learn more. And thanks.